Hello, and welcome to the Nature of Invisible Things, the podcast. I'm your host, Erin Kelly, and I'm so glad you're here. This is season 2, episode 17, and today I am pleased to welcome back astrologer and soul worker Amanda Moreno, who is here to share her story of one of her midlife transits, the Pluto square Pluto. And in this personal journey, Amanda does share that she experiences a series of health crises and complications that did impact her personal relationships, career, and physical well being. And so we are issuing a moderate content warning for this episode. While we don't go into graphic detail in any way, we did want to let folks know in the event that they're feeling a bit sensitive and just to take care of yourselves if need be. And I am deeply honored by Amanda's presence on this episode. I was privileged to have Amanda as one of my very first astrology teachers. And I just wanted to remind you that if you're listening to the audio version of this, you can find a link in the show notes to watch this episode on YouTube, as we'll be sharing Amanda's chart to illustrate the aspects. So join us as we explore Pluto's significance in astrology, particularly in its role in deep seated emotional patterns and unconscious coping mechanisms linked to early experiences and past lives. But first, I have an announcement. So I'm excited to share that as of September 1st, I will be accepting applications for the 2025 cohort of Sovereign. This is my experimental container that runs from the equinox through the solstice. And this year, the focus is on transformational partnership. So if you're interested in expanding your view of one-to-one relationships beyond the romantic, check out the link in the show notes. Okay, let's get started, and I'll introduce Amanda to you by way of her bio. Amanda is an astrologer, soul worker, and educator based in Seattle, Washington. She is an anarchistically non monogamous witch who prefers to avoid labels but admits to being an introvert. Amanda obtained her master's degree in depth psychology with a focus on how astrology can help us navigate personal and collective rites of passage. Throughout her 15 years of working with clients and students, she has remained passionate about working with astrology as an embodied, revelatory, socially conscious, and living way of knowing that is a perfect pal when it comes to dealing with cascades of collective shifts that we are living through. Amanda's deepest honor in life is helping folks connect with their soul stories. Her approach is deeply influenced by animism, witchcraft, pleasure, empathy, collective liberation, and her love of music and the land. You can book a session with Amanda or check out her work and podcasts at aquarianspirals.com. Follow her on Instagram at Aquarian Spirals and read her writing at the Astrophile on Substack. I've also got a link to Amanda's NORWAC 2025 lecture on working with midlife transits. I highly recommend checking that out. And also a link to learn more about her forthcoming evolutionary astrology immersion. I took this or a version of this in 2022, and I highly recommend Amanda as a teacher and the experience in general. So enjoy. Welcome back, Amanda, to the Nature of Invisible Things podcast. I am so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me again, Erin.
I couldn't wait to have you back. I actually wanted to have you back sooner than this, you know? I really enjoyed our conversation, and I have to like admit a confession. I think because you are have been my teacher for like 3-ish years and beyond in other circumstances, I think I was really nervous
Oh,
about like interviewing you. And so I know there was so much more we could have said. And I was like, I thought about it later and I was like, oh, I could have asked so much more. But I think I was like in that position of being almost starstruck, but in a like teacher student way. So I'm
oh.
glad that you're back and I'm a little bit more grounded this time.
Well, thanks for saying that. And also, like, I really appreciate the container that you have for this podcast and how easy it is to talk about really rich and complex subjects in really approachable ways. So thanks for doing this.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoy it. And so I was really excited to have you back, particularly for this topic as well, because I attended NORWAC this year, earlier in May, and Amanda is a frequent speaker at NORWAC, and you had two lectures this year. And I got to attend one in person, and I listened to one after the other one afterwards. And it was on the transits of midlife, which listeners, if they have been following along, they know that that's been a kind of a sporadic series at this point that I've been addressing on this podcast. And we'll link the lecture in the show notes. And it was just fantastic. It was really amazing and so validating. I remember just like sitting in the front row and just nodding along and being like so validated in that experience of like what I had, and also frankly glad that I'm on the other side of most of them.
Right?
So, yeah, and then afterwards we were talking about it, and you had mentioned that you are open to coming on the nature of invisible things and talking about your Pluto square. And so before we get into that, I thought we'd talk just a little bit about midlife transits and for as a refresher for folks. And so, yeah, so
Yeah.
what would you say about those?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my like elevator pitch is one, whoa, and two, midlife transits can really be anything in the second Saturn cycle. So we can think of like the first Saturn cycle up through about age 30 as being, kind of like adolescence, which, the lie that you should know what you want to do with your life when you're 18 is a
Mm,
big one. Because you don't know who you are. But there's that first one, and then the second one, 30 to 60-ish, is kind of midlife. But where folks tend to, put a lot of the focus is the Pluto square, the Neptune square, the Uranus opposition, and the Saturn opposition. And, I think one of the key pieces of this is that because it is the outer planets aspecting themselves, it's when we are confronting not only our deepest shit and our sense of authority and internal power, but we're doing that in the context of what is happening at the collective level at that time. And so there's a strong interplay between, you know, who have I been? Who do I want to be? What are my, survival skills? What are my coping mechanisms? And how am I going to bring forward my power in the context of what's happening at the collective level?
mm,
And so, I'm fascinated with them for so many reasons, but one is that we're living through such a time of the words lose meaning, right? But like unprecedented change and like really pervasive systemic collapse.
mhm.
And so to see what's happening in people's midlife transits at this time is just fascinating to me. And for, our generation and for like folks born in the last 30, 40 years, the Pluto square is what kicks off the other three core transits that I talked about. But we're in a process of Pluto because its orbit is elliptical, elongated. We're in the process of the Pluto square happening later. So by the time we get to folks with, a natal 0 degrees Capricorn Pluto, they won't have their Pluto square until their late 50s. So the shape of midlife is changing. And I think that that's at a very basic level, like, yeah, Pluto square is like confrontation with the volcanic forces of the psyche, and having
Mm,
that happen earlier kind of rotor-rooters out some shit. And I think, in my worldview, that's like kind of propelling us into like, yeah, we need to be leaders now, quick.
right,
Go.
right. I love what you just shared because it reminded me of, I think, the crux of your lecture about folks experiencing all of this against the backdrop of the world events, of the global events, of our collective consciousness events that are also happening. I think that's something that for me, until I went through my Uranus opposition, I didn't have that context. Because for me that's when I really felt like, is no one like, it's really upsetting to me like what I am seeing in the world, and like this I felt like I was having a solo internal experience of it, where my Neptune square and my Pluto square didn't, it wasn't as maybe polarizing for me in that way.
Mhm.
But it's interesting because now, as you mentioned, like when I had my Pluto, first Pluto square, that was more than 10 years ago at this point. We're at a different point culturally, so it might make sense too for that. But yeah, that's fascinating. So I love that because that's something that I think changes the tone and the context.
Yeah, it changes the tone and the context, and not everyone's going to have like a huge soul-shaking, life-changing experience for all or any of these transits or the Pluto square, right? But like
Hmm.
for the people who do get drug into it, it's so loud. And I'm talking specifically here about, the Pluto square, but like you're talking about the Uranus opposition, and
Yeah,
I think like that's the one that tends to be more across the board.
gotcha.
Really impactful. Um, and that's the one that you see like the cliches associated with like the, dude who goes out and buys the red sports card or like affairs that happen,
Right.
right? Because there's a rebellion against the norm, whatever
Hmm.
norm has been built. And that's, going to be different for everyone. Um, but yeah, I feel like going through the Pluto square in the way that I did before the others, it made the others easier potentially.
Hmm.
Ish. It's all relative,
Yeah.
right? But it was such a big explosion for me that then it was like, all right, well, at least my Uranus opposition isn't that.
Hmm. Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, mine weren't equal in their magnitude either. And I will also say like my Uranus opposition is still pretty fresh, I feel.
Mm.
Where my Pluto square, I have so much distance from it
Distance.
now. Yeah, like I can start to plug into how my personal themes of my own underworld experience actually are or were reflected in the larger spectrum. You know, a lot of it was around relationships. I mean, I'm a Pluto and Libra generation as
Mhm.
well. And I think we're going to, see another example of that in our discussion today when we talk about your Pluto square as well. And so, yeah, and I think it's interesting. Also, our Pluto square, our generation was in the cardinal
Mhm.
axis, where folks experiencing it now are in the fixed axis. And I just thinking about the modality of those signs,
Mhm.
um, really makes me think of like how one might experience that, as well as the fact
Sure.
not to everyone's going to experience it slightly differently, so don't panic when you hear this, but Pluto, because of its elliptical orbit, is slowing down. So not only are these transits going to start happening further out for some folks, they're going to be longer.
Longer. Yeah.
Yeah, and just that added to the fixity of Scorpio and Aquarius is just wow. It's really something that has some gravity to it. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And the Pluto square and the Neptune square usually have either 3 or 5 exact hits.
mhm,
And so that's going to be true even as they're slowing down. And so we're talking about really long periods of time where this is in effect. And that doesn't mean that any intensity that comes is going to be consistent for that whole amount of
true.
time or constant, I should say. Um, but one of the ways I like to frame that sometimes is like, can you imagine if we had a shorter period of time to learn the things that these transits bring up? Like it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
You need the space to kind of like live and breathe and be with it,
Yeah.
for better or worse.
The somewhat graphic image that came to mind when you said that is like people who give birth very quickly and people who have like a more sustained labor where the body has time to kind of adjust versus when baby is just coming out,
Mhm.
or there's some impetus where the baby has to be born very quickly and it's just like the the physical trauma on the body that happens as a result if we think about like our psyche as having a structure and going through those massive changes.
Mhm.
Yeah, there I would say yeah, so I'm curious, like when we get into it too, like we'll hear more about maybe we might hear some of the cardinality of your experience as well.
Yeah, the cardinality, and also it's worth keeping in mind that, Pluto in Libra has a Pluto that's ruled by Venus. Pluto
True.
in Scorpio has a Pluto that's ruled by Mars,
Hmm.
right? So even those kind of little tiny shifts give really big textural changes to it.
Yeah.
Although both are very relational at
Hmm.
their core. Let me just kind of say a couple words about like
Sure.
Pluto as a baseline, like what is Pluto doing? So, the outer planets are what we refer to as more subtle forces, right? They can't be seen with the naked eye. And subtle but mighty. Okay, so they can still be loud, but Pluto is describing kind of like the what I say is the deep currents of the soul or are very deeply rooted entrenched coping strategies, coping patterns, particularly emotional coping patterns. The ones that are really loud and somewhat involuntarily when we're potentially triggered.
Yeah.
The ones that are linked to childhood stuff, right? Our like deepest emotional impacts and emotional environment in some ways. Um, and the things that keep us safe, right? So they're kind of like just a baseline go-to when things get intense. It's what we kind of click into, and it's what we often, I think, will encounter in things like therapy. Um, with an important piece there being that Pluto material is often very deep, deeply unconscious emotional stuff. And, unconscious meaning you don't see it. You don't tend to like have conscious awareness of it, but it's very present. And so, within that, with Pluto in the signs, it's going to get into the kind of generational signatures, right? So Pluto in Libra is a generation of people who are, and this is going to be very like conceptual and vague, but people who are dealing with, you know, patterns, whether that's from childhood or past lives, of decentering themselves in relationship, of being really highly attuned to the needs of others, right? We'll see that come through in a lot of different ways. But it's not like they're saying, like, I need to make sure your needs are met. It's
Hmm.
an involuntary thing. And so there can be tendencies toward, or, it's folks who are working more on like patterns of what we might call codependency, or just like, who do I need to be in order to keep you in my life? Because, if this relationship goes, then I'll die, right? Pluto is
Hmm.
often linked very closely to what we might call irrational death fears, right? So if this person goes, I'll die. If this relationship goes, I'll die. And so there it gets that kind of supercharge to it.
Hmm.
Um, and we could say with Pluto, the way that it gets more personal is by house placement, right? So the sign is going to be more of a generational theme, and then the house placement is going to give you an area of life where those coping strategies might be, more likely to be triggered. And then we can get into aspects and all of that.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does. It
Okay.
does. Yeah. I was definitely thinking about that too, like how not everyone Pluto and Neptune, their transits in particular, not everyone will receive conjunctions or certain aspects from those two planets if they're living an average, human lifespan. Uranus gets around the chart if we're lucky to live to
84 years. Yeah,
84 years. But the rest of us, like some of us, depending upon our chart configuration, we're going to experience Pluto and Neptune in various ways, in addition to that, the house placement as
right.
well.
So, I was born with Pluto in the third house, and by transit, Pluto will likely not make it much further than my ninth house before I die,
Hmm.
right? Probably eighth.
Right.
Fingers crossed. Um, but it is this kind of slow volcanic emotional rotor-rooting force.
Hmm.
And I think to some extent all of the outers can have to do with our deepest fears, but Pluto is those things that like live in the depths. That can be very harrowing. And so it is, I think, of all the outer planets, the one that's most directly linked to our emotional body,
Hmm.
essentially. Whereas we could say Neptune's more of spiritual, like the outer energy body.
Right.
And Uranus is more about like mind and nervous system and things like that. From the perspective of evolutionary astrology, The chart is a way of understanding where the soul has been, and Pluto is the core symbol for the soul. And so it's just like, I don't remember my past lives, right? So it's just out of conscious memory. It's the things that live within us that also survive the trauma of death, right? That like carry forward with us as imprints. And there's other ways of languaging that,
Mm-hmm.
there's spiritual ways, but there's also epigenetics and, intergenerational trauma and intergenerational gifts as well, right? That's all very much Plutonian territory. And so it's those things that have a root that we can't necessarily like see in our lives, but then looking at the chart, we can understand where the soul has been, what the soul is trying to like grapple with at this point, and ways the soul like has, tools and gifts for that, and also where the soul is going and what challenges might be too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, in I think EA in some ways can be to me pleasantly reductive, but like
Mm-hmm.
one of the core teachings is that there's a polarity point, right? If you've done Pluto and Libra in the third house for, that's the thing that's up right now. It's been overdone. One of the ways of kind of balancing it out is by stretching to the opposite, right? Aries, ninth house.
Mm-hmm.
And within that, there's a lot of challenges because, again, like very basic ideas here. If you're very used to automatically decentering yourself and just becoming who other people need you to be, the act of like reaching for your own spark, your own needs is not like a highly developed skill,
Right.
right? Not like unless a person has a bunch of planets in Aries,
Mm-hmm.
like there's a little bonus there. But then that energy, especially something like Aries, can be really unwieldy, right? Like
Yeah.
I've never expressed anger in my life, and now I've like gotten triggered and angry, like it might burn some things down,
Yep.
literally or metaphorically. And so there is that kind of like, there's a way of working with this that is stretching to the opposite and getting to know the opposite
Mm-hmm.
while honoring that there's gifts in the natal placements too.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that perspective that EA has because I do think while possibly reductive, what I love about it is it does give this so much dimension to the outer planets where traditional astrology just doesn't, or Hellenistic early astrology just doesn't have that because they didn't really know about
Mhm.
those planets or have that frame of reference. And consciousness wise, we weren't there yet either. So as far as I know, I mean, who knows? I have past lives. I don't remember any of them. So this is all just,
Yeah,
but go ahead.
but one of the things I really love about this perspective and the way that I work with it, right? There's lots of different schools of evolutionary astrology, but the way that I work with it is it keeps me in contact with the fact that like we've all been here for a really long time. We've all been having these experiences for a really long time. And I have so much freaking empathy because to be a living being on this earth is complicated, and like there's oftentimes situations where there's not like a right or a wrong decision. We just have decisions that we have to make. And so within that, there's just so much compassion and so much empathy for what we go through.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that because I think that's where I started to pick up on was the fact that some of this stuff that we don't know is there isn't necessarily something that we experienced in this lifetime.
Right.
It could be these patterns that we're moving through over longer cycles of time.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's really
Or just
fascinating.
things that we don't remember from childhood,
True.
right? Or things that were, what my therapist calls little T traumas,
Yeah.
right? Like we were running through the woods and having the time of our lives, and then we trip over a root and like break our leg. And like
Hmm.
it's not like some kind of huge swoop of
Right.
violence comes in, right? It's just like body gets traumatized.
Yeah, or like mom couldn't pick you up at that moment because the pot was boiling over on the stove, and like
Right,
you didn't get that need met immediately and then the rejection, there's like
right.
little T traumas like that. So
But then
totally.
that also brings up that a lot of times with Pluto, what we're talking about is uh, reactions to things that seem disproportionate, heavy quotes.
Hmm.
Something happens and we are, something small happens and then we are, bedridden with grief for 2 months.
Yeah.
And it seems like the event doesn't match up with the level of emotionality that arises as a response to it. And that's very much Plutonian terrain.
Hmm.
Um, and then like you're saying, I do believe in past lives. I do past life regression, and I've come to understand so much about my third house Pluto through those regressions, both through like relationships, because it's Pluto in Libra,
Yeah.
but things that have happened with siblings, third house in past lives, things that have happened with vows. I've lots of lifetimes in service
Ooh
to
wee.
different, things and different beings, and those vows that come in that are like eternal vows that then carry, and then you're born with no conscious recognition of the vow, right? Like all of that stuff is very real and impactful in my world.
Totally. When you just I had a visceral reaction when you said the word vow. I'll just say that. Also Pluto and Libra generation. Like what?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
did a I did a past life regression once. I won't get into the whole thing, but in
Sure.
the afterlife state when we're doing the healing, my guide showed me all of my vows as kind of like a golden chain. And they were like, "Do you want these?" And I said no. And then all the links just started popping open.
Popping. That's
Like I could hear them
amazing.
clink, 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 clink. And I was like, "Oh yeah, that was a lot. Like that was a lot of weight."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's weighty stuff for
Hmm.
sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's I could go on a whole diatribe about relationship and I don't want to do that, but it's just such of a if you think about it, like we're always in relation to something.
Yes, absolutely.
So Pluto was in Libra for a short time compared to other signs, but I mean, holy hell,
Hmm.
right? Like
Hmm.
basically, I don't know. I can't speak for other Pluto experiences because I only have Pluto in Libra, but I imagine it was short, but it was impactful.
Sure. And there, something I think is very true about Pluto and Libras is that because it is cardinal, it's a generation that is initiating new ways of relating
Right.
at those very deep fundamental levels. And that's not to say that there aren't other people who have done relationship in the ways that we're doing, but if you even look at Pluto and Libras coming into positions of leadership
Mm-hmm.
and the
Yes.
ways that they are leading are so different. I have a lecture about that on my website too, like Pluto and Libras and relationship in particular. Um, because there's so much about the ways that we relate to each other and the world that are really dysfunctional and harmful, right? So
Mm.
it's kind of like this generation is rootering out that shit to try and do it a little bit differently
Yeah.
or a lot. So my
Is
Pluto square, for whatever reason, my chart, my life, my transits tend to be very concretely, the astrology shows itself in very concrete and sometimes extreme ways.
yeah,
And that's not the case for everyone.
right.
And like, I'm really inviting people to listen lightly in some ways, right? Like, because we are going into the realms of fear a little bit here
Mm-hmm.
with Pluto transits. And so, um, I'm gonna give examples that are sometimes extreme, and that's not to say that this is how this plays out for everyone.
Right. And I'll just add too, I've taken a look at some of the information that Amanda has shared with me chart wise. And one thing I wanted to point out, because you mentioned fear, is you do have Chiron playing a part in some of these transits too. I as well, also in mine. And in the conversation I had with Gina Piccolo on the Chiron return, we really dove into like fear and like the how that also gets kind of dredged up in there along with the Pluto stuff. And so, yeah, I definitely think it's I mean, I it is one of the more extreme Pluto square experiences I've seen astrologically. So I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about it. Okay, I am sharing that. You should be able to see it now.
Yeah. And so I guess just kind of calling out a couple of things here. One, you'll see Pluto in the third house at 2142 Libra. I've already, talked about some of the core themes of Pluto in Libra, but in the third house, Pluto is oftentimes gets really, obsessive about information. And with it being in Libra, one of the big ways it shows up for me is like in relationships, I have tended to, particularly if I'm feeling insecure, like want more information from my partners. And I think, I work with people a lot. That's a pretty common
Yeah.
thing. But it is very much the sense of like, if I don't have information, if I don't know like what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're doing, then the catastrophe is going to happen. And
Mm,
so it's very supercharged.
yeah.
Um, it's also shown up in terms of, I have a sibling who committed suicide, so third house is relating to siblings. Um, and then a couple other things that I will bring up, but just by way of kind of like creating context, because we've talked about midlife being like the first Saturn return to the second Saturn return.
Hmm.
Um, and you know, during my Saturn return, the first day of my Saturn return, I was sitting in my master's program, starting a program in depth psychology, which is where I ended up writing a master's thesis on astrology and apocalyptic imagery. So that's setting the scene for my midlife,
Hmm.
right? And then, my Pluto square story for me really starts in 2017. And at that point, Pluto was coming up to 19 Capricorn, so 2 degrees out. I often say that the Pluto square and the Neptune square, you'll get whiffs of them at about 5 degrees applying, which is wide.
Hmm.
And also, it's there. But at that time, I was in my opening Saturn square as well. So we had Saturn conjunct that Neptune, squaring Venus and Saturn.
Hmm.
And what was happening at that time was I had decided to go full time with astrology. I was feeling really excited about it. I had my nodal return going on. I was like living the polyamorous dream in like a cohabitating situation. I was getting my first invitations to speak publicly where I was talking about non-monogamy and astrology. And also, I had had 2 years of getting intuitive hits that I had some kind of growth in my reproductive system.
Mm.
And I was lucky enough to have doctors who would do scans. And so I was getting scans and nothing was showing up. But then in the summer of 2017, when Pluto was, around the like 18-degree mark, I was in an epic amount of pain. Nobody knew what was going on. And long story short, it ended up being a large, very, very large growth on my left ovary.
My goodness.
And at that time, I had started a new relationship, and it was somebody who was wonderful. And also, like five months into our relationship, I had to go in for a surgery where they were going to remove this growth that I was assured was almost definitely not cancer. Um, but if it was cancer, then they would be I would be getting a full hysterectomy. And so I went into that. It ended up being ovarian cancer. It
Mm.
was caught very, very, very early, which is very rare for ovarian cancer, but I had to have a full hysterectomy and essentially came out of that experience an entirely different human. I mean, I was in surgical menopause at age 37, which is a condition that is not well studied, understood, but definitely like can decrease mortality.
Hmm.
Um, and this partner who I'd been with for 5 months had to call my mom and tell her, had to call my best friend. So it was just a lot of intensity in our early relationship. And, I didn't have to have chemo. I didn't have to, do any of that. But this was also, and I think this is worth noting that this was around the time I had started doing magic and spell work as a witch as well. And the third
Mm.
house we get, like it's the house of the goddess, the house of ritual. I was working with the goddess. Um, she was showing up in very profound ways. Like I remember the morning of that surgery going out to the car, and there was a very large white rabbit just sitting there.
Mm.
And my partner was like, "Is this what your life is like?" And I was like, "Yeah, she's just letting us know that she's there." Um, and so that kind of like that passed and it was intense, but I did a trust fall into community. There was that nodal activation through the nodal return, and I have the
Hmm.
South Node in Aquarius. Um, and it thank God it wasn't worse than it was. And also my body wasn't working the way that I was used to it working. And, suddenly not having any hormones, having to have them through replacement was a big deal.
Mm,
And so by the time I got to this date, this May date, about 6 months before this, after lots of pushing at practitioners, because I knew something else was wrong, we had discovered a very large incisional hernia from the
mm,
original incision, which was about 10 inches up my abdomen. Um, so I had to have a second surgery to correct that. And I was told that it would be, as invasive as the first on some fronts, but they wouldn't be taking out organs. And so, yay for that. And so at this time, I was still in that relationship. Um, and part of what was happening in the prep to the surgery was I was, just trying to manage everybody's everything. This is part of what my Pluto does, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
where are you going to be at this time? Who's taking care of me at this time? It was very stressful. And then the surgery itself ended up being, 4 hours instead of an hour and a half. It was very brutal. Um, and my partner it was maxed,
Yeah.
just kind of in a state of shutdown because it was all maxed. I know that they were really trying to like be there and be stable, but also, through events I won't get into, it was way over their head. And I got out of the hospital, and this week, when you can see, Pluto's at 22, Saturn's at 20, the moon's at 19, the south node's at
Mm-hmm.
18, and that's all on the sixth house cusp. So all of these planets are squaring from the house of health, essentially, and, acute
Yeah.
illness. Um, so we're into exactitude here. It would have been about the second hit of three.
Mm-hmm.
I developed a dry cough, which I do sometimes because of allergies. And I'm just going to pause here because this next part is a little bit
Mm-hmm.
visceral.
Okay.
Um, it caused my incision to break open.
Mm,
And so, long story short, I was left with a gaping hole in my abdomen that went straight through to my intestines. Because once that happens, they can't sew you back up. You have to wait for it to knit back together slowly and just kind of like hope that it doesn't get infected. And when that happened, I became super reliant on my relationships.
mm-hmm.
And a lot of them failed. My closest relationships at that time,
Mm,
just, for different reasons, left. And I had to find people in my community to come in every day and repack the wound with gauze. Um, I had, a fight with my partner because they had pinged my betrayal stuff.
mm,
And it was as I was in a very vulnerable state. And at the same time, my living situation became untenable because my roommates started having parties above my bed in this first week when I was just, again, very compromised, to a point where another friend came and got me and took me to a hotel.
mm,
And then that situation escalated, and I had to move while I couldn't lift anything more than 5 pounds. Um, I was getting served with papers because I had some debts that were overdue. So I
yeah.
had people coming to serve me with papers at this time. And so the stress of it was off the charts.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember thinking at that time, this is Pluto and Libra stuff. Like, this is, how do I keep centering myself and my needs amidst all of this kind of chaos that's happening and stress that's happening and health stuff that's happening? And essentially, like, just keep swimming, like, just keep one foot in front of the other until I get to a point where I can deal with
Mm-hmm.
it. And, one of the things about starting a full-time astrology practice like the biggest thing for me had been that I didn't have a financial safety net.
Mm.
And what would I do if there was a health crisis?
Mm.
And I remember in 2015 doing some astro drama, and there are people playing my third house Pluto, and there but is somebody playing transiting Pluto because I was like, what is my Pluto square going to be like? And the person directing the scene had me come up and stand between the two Plutos, and transiting Pluto came, and the person portraying transiting Pluto just like gently put their hands on my shoulders, and my system received it as like a weight, and I dropped to the floor.
Wow.
And I was like, okay. Um, and so just kind of complete this part of the story, I my immune system was in a very bad
Mhm.
place. I had a piece of mesh stapled to my sternum and my pelvis. And by August of this year, I had gone to like 15 different specialists just saying like something is wrong with my system, like how, and everybody was just like, you need to lose weight. And so I finally found a doctor who, 6 months before the pandemic, identified post-viral syndromes, inflammatory syndromes, and chronic Lyme disease. And I was able to kind of start addressing what it meant to have a dysregulated nervous system.
Mm.
And this, one of the things that interests me about the sixth and 12th house axis is that it can be associated with acute and chronic illness.
Right.
And this very much was the entry point to my dealing with chronic illness.
Mm.
Um, so I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, that Amanda is just it's overwhelming because any one of those things by themselves would cause stress and
Mhm.
be overwhelming for anyone to deal with as a singular occurrence. But to have all of those happening concurrently, I cannot possibly imagine like how overwhelming and how lonely that probably was for you. And so I just want to thank you for sharing your story and being able to tell that um, with such grace and also having come like on the other side as well.
Yeah, right.
Just,
That distance thing helps.
I
But
mean,
as we were saying before we got started, like I want to write a memoir about this because I do think that it's a story worth sharing in an astrological context because it's a really good teaching
mhm.
tool. But anytime I sit down to write it, I'm just like,
Yeah,
like the distance isn't quite enough yet.
right, right. Yeah, and two, it's interesting because a couple of things that I was like looking at like in your chart as well, throughout this period too was the like the Venus Uranus Chiron
Mhm.
conjunction that was happening around this time as well. We already talked about like you had been through the nodal return, and then the North Node was had have moved through the 12th house as well. And so there's this, and the South Node just near the luminaries or on the luminaries is just really hard in general.
Yeah, that's reminding me that the surgery took place in May, but it was originally supposed to take place in February. And so when the North Node was in the 12th,
Yeah.
and 2 days before, I got a call from the doctor's office saying like there had been an emergency and it had to be rescheduled. And then whatever, I won't get into that part, but I had been feeling really bad about it. I was like, this is not going to go well. And after I got that call, it had to be rescheduled. I contacted an astrologer and I was like, can you help me understand like when this surgery should take place? And she was essentially like, it's not going to be an easy surgery, but if you can wait until the North Node gets out of the 12th,
Hmm.
that will give you a little bit more of a grasp in terms of getting support from people. And it probably won't be the people you want support from. And what ended up happening as my kind of like core people dispersed was all of these other people who I knew very lightly stepped in. Like I posted on Facebook and was like, I need a place to move in the next 2 weeks. And these people who I knew very lightly were like, we have this spot that's essentially like for this purpose. And just so many people that stepped up and
Mm.
in to help was like so heartening and amazing. And it all really did centralize around like me just being like, this is what I need. This is what has to happen,
Yeah.
right? That Aries stuff. But also the, Chiron Vesta and my Pluto are both ruled by Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And this all kind of started when Chiron was conjunct my Venus.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Because when I looked at your, like the first pass happened a few days before your solar return. The first exact was
Hmm.
like February 3rd.
Yeah.
And so I was curious, like, who were the perfected rulers at that
Hmm.
time? And it was Venus in
Hmm.
that right before your solar return in 2019, Venus was your perfected ruler. It was a Libra period. So that Pluto part of your third house and that Pluto part of your second house, or the Libra part of your second house, that was all
Hmm.
active
Hmm.
at that time as well. And then Chiron, yeah, was like right in that area too. And then when I was looking at as well is like then you moved into like Mars as your time lord on that solar return. And it's interesting at this point, here we have Mars in Cancer. Mars rules your moon. And then there's this like the moon being like received by Mars in some way, or the Mars being received by the moon, and in the 11th
Hmm.
house. And so, yeah, as harrowing as an experience as that was, like there are places of where we can see in hindsight. I don't know that any astrologer would have been able to maybe pull this apart unless there was some maybe also intuitive or like some
Hmm.
other modalities besides just the what we know about the study of astrology. But there were like signatures in the chart, like looking back of some support, of some like things were going to work out. I think but as harrowing as it is, because when we perfected too, like from your sect light, which is the moon, because you were born in the evening, that puts you in this Aquarius period ruled by Saturn, and Saturn is all up in this business as well.
Yeah.
And not only that, but you had so Saturn and Pluto and the moon and the south node in this particular chart that we're looking at with the transits. But at some point, like right before this, at the end of April, April 29th, both Pluto, well, and Saturn like station retrograde
Hmm.
in that square. And for folks listening, like when planets station retrograde, like that's a big deal because they appear to slow down and spend more time in that area. So it was like the volume was really
They
being turned
emphasize
up.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The reproductive stuff comes through because in several ways, in the 2017 surgery,
Hmm.
Saturn was conjunct that fifth house Neptune.
Yeah.
And then in this one, Jupiter is
Is there as
conjunct,
well.
right? And then there's Venus stuff going on too. But I really appreciate you bringing up that kind of right in perspective, you can see the support type of thing, right? Because sometimes people really don't like that.
Yeah.
I do. I need that, right? Like I am always looking for what is this, what purpose is this serving? And it's not to say I always come up with a purpose, but for me
Right.
personally in this period, because it wasn't just a confrontation with my like, how do I exist in relationship when I can't trust people because they're going to let me down? It was also a huge confrontation with myself as a healer. I mean, the ways I had to dig into everything I knew as a witch, as a healer, all of that stuff were profound. And I mean, there was complications after that,
Yeah.
hole opened up. And I remember 6 weeks later going to see the surgeon and him just being like, I don't know how this hole closed up this quickly, but
Mm.
whatever you did, like, can
Hmm.
you teach me?
Right.
Right. And it was so much visualization and other things that were going into it. And also, if we take that thread of the midlife transits, pulling in the collective level.
Hmm.
right? The first thing I was encountering was how difficult it was to get help, not just as a, person who was fat, but as a person in a system that does not study my body and that does not take post-viral syndrome seriously. And I had 6 months ahead of the pandemic to focus on my immune system
Mm,
and went into the pandemic fully understanding what post-viral syndromes do.
yeah.
And so that kind of like just all of that coming into the collective story for me has always been really just mind-blowing. And I wouldn't say that I would go through it again, right? But like I'm grateful that I have been able to make meaning out of it.
Yeah.
Um, and there's still things that linger. Like I have PTSD from this.
Yeah, I can
Um,
imagine. I can imagine that.
but it is a cohesive storyline with these midlife transits, right? And that is not just the ones we've talked about and the
Hmm.
Saturn and hard aspect to itself, but also the nodal return. And there's a Saturn trine around the age of 40. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's all kind of like building on itself. And this is why I always tell my students, like, if you're not a good personal historian, become one now, because if you can track your life story with your transits and your progressions and everything else, like you will learn so quickly.
Absolutely. One thing that I've used to fill in the gaps is like email. So like where my journals had gaps, I was able to like go look at specific time
Yes.
periods by searching my email for
Yes.
dates.
Absolutely. I do that too.
Yeah.
Because
And
email
it
has dates and times.
dates and times
Hmm.
and all kinds of things can come up like when you've had like a when you've been using it for so long, for
Hmm.
sure. I know I've used that too. But yeah, I think looking this, what you're bringing up too about like the not only tracking your personal history or keeping record of it in some way, I think is so impactful because when we do look back, and whether you want to write a memoir about it or not, we can do utilize that information to then kind of go back and do some of that energetic work or like the spiritual work that we can do to like do some revisiting or healing or I hate to use the word healing because I feel like it's taken out of context, but I do feel that there is work that we can do personally and in trusted partnership with practitioners that can um, make big strides in helping to repair or to like move on or to get deeper synthesis with like these events that happen to
Yes.
us in our
Yeah.
lives.
And I mean, I also struggle with the word healing, but I've had like when I'm using it, I'm not talking about like an upward trajectory of like arriving at a point where like I am healed. It's more just
Right.
like life is a process of,
Right.
healing
Yeah.
sometimes and, uncut like ripping off the Band-Aid other times, right? Like I get that.
When looking at your zodiacal releasing, which is another traditional timing technique that we use, when we look at the lot of fortune, which for is the one that, even though it sounds funny, like I always used to think lot of fortune was like the career one, but it's not.
Mhm.
It's like the health
The
and
health and
wellness
body.
one,
Yeah.
the health and body one. But you were also in your L1 was a Capricorn period,
Mhm.
which if you're not familiar, listeners, with what that means, it just because Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, which Amanda has opposite Venus, and it's the out of sect malefic, it just means it's likely a more challenging time period, just overall. And the fact that all of this was happening in Capricorn, and then I think the wild card in all this is that South Node kind of going through there as well, like the nodal axis really. That to me, I don't know why. Whenever I think about the nodes, and I know evolutionary astrology has a slightly different perspective than maybe like tr- some of the Hellenistic astrology, and then there's like the Vedic perspective and whatnot. But I
I love
see
them
it,
all.
I do too. I see it as like they're like this big like mixing bowl. They just get
Mhm.
in there and they're mixing. Like you don't really know always what you're gonna get, other than that traditionally we have seen the nodes being the south node in particular being really challenging on the luminaries. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it is that like you don't know what you're gonna get. And as an astrologer, I was like, I know what I'm afraid of for this period.
Yeah.
And then a lot of it maybe all of it came to pass, right? And it's like, I think that being really familiar with my Pluto material and seeing how much, even though I was aware of it, how much it still impacted me was really humbling.
Yeah.
Because I was just like, oh yeah, this is all like the fears and the relational like clinging that I wanted to do was all so loud, and I couldn't like in the moment be like, well, I'm going to reach for my polarity point, yada yada yada. I mean, I
Right.
did still, and it ended up being a time where like heavy Aries and heavy Leo North Node, like I
Mm-hmm.
cannot deal with anyone else's anything right now. It is all about me.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
but it was, yeah, it was very intense. And a time for like intense emotional honesty, which is I think another good kind of like tip or keywords for the Pluto square.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, I felt in a way like I was dealing with things that I thought like were handled for me, like in mine. Like I thought like I had moved past this type of thing, but I was shown multiple ways that it was kind of like showing up. And then
Mhm.
I feel like it's an onion that can, for me, has continued to peel and reveal itself. So also Pluto in Libra, mine happens to be in the eighth or the seventh, depending upon what house system you're utilizing. Pluto in Libra in the seventh, like what the hell? That is not fair. Not fair.
Just straightforward.
That's like too a little too on the nose. Yeah, if you look in my chart in Porphyry, it's in the seventh, I believe. And that I just saw like my codependence everywhere. Like or my tendency to be codependent. Like I would work on it in one area of my life, but then it would start to pop up in other areas
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
wild to me.
I mean, that's like the, codependent thing or just like not being able to hold center, like hold identity. I mean, I am a very confident, secure, like self-assured person. And you put me into the orbit of another human that I'm romantically and sexually involved with, and it just like, foop, it is so hard for me to keep it. Like, it is an active practice all of the frickin' time even after, 15 years of explicitly like identifying and working on it. I
Hmm.
mean, it's vortex.
It is. It is. And how has the Pluto in Aquarius been for you now? We've had a little bit of time to kind of talk about that. I'm just curious because like eventually it's going to take a while, but it'll get to your
It's gonna
sun.
get there. First, it'll square my Chiron at the same time as Saturn is conjunct it, but whatever.
Oof.
Pluto and Aquarius, I mean, Uh, it is just the world for me right now. Like how, like the systems are corrupt and corrosive, right? I think of Pluto and Aquarius as being about the systems,
Yeah.
right? Like social systems, social networks, and the kind of like social codes that keep society going, right? And they are rotten to the core.
Hmm.
And so for me, it's just kind of like seeing it all and like what is my place in this alongside a really just deep discontent and disgruntlement with humans
Right.
and with fucking group projects.
Yeah.
Like I don't this human group project is rough, man.
Actually, not thank you for saying that because actually now I'm wondering if some of my tendency to hibernate that I've been experiencing is actually this like Pluto Uranus situation. Um, Uranus just kind of like energizing it a little bit with that via
The
that
trine.
trine.
Yeah.
Because yeah, Pluto is in whole sign, it's my 12th.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about a lot is, that my Pluto square was taking place in Porphyry when Pluto was entering my sixth house of service, right? And it really was a confrontation with how I am going to be of service during this time. And, my whole adult life has been that in some way. Like I was working in mental health nonprofits before I was an astrologer, so that's not new, but I think that in the last, since October 7th, really, um, it's not like a collapsing within me, but just like I'm standing in the river of time and the waters were rushing past and I'm just like,
Yeah.
okay, like here we are in it, right? Because I think part of the Aquarian consciousness to me, and we can see that through Pluto and Aquarius. I have an Aquarius South Node and Sun, is like a ability to see not just like past, present, and future, but like the threads of the systems that we're in and like the potentials for where they're going. And right now that feels exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely been a little more. I'm starting to like be able to articulate what it is now, where before I was like, I don't know. Like it's
Yeah.
just kind of amorphous. Like especially when Neptune too first moved into Aries, I was like, and of course I had it like right up in my business. So did you, like with
Mhm.
your Venus. But so when it first moved, I was like, where'd you go?
What?
Where are you? Because
Oh, I'm
it's
already like, come back.
and
Come snuggle
and
up
it
with me
will.
again.
Yeah. And so one thing that I love about your lecture that you did at Norwalk this year, which we'll link in the show notes for folks, highly recommend checking it out. What I love is like the context and the breadth that you were able to cover in that period. But also Amanda had a lot of suggestions, and not that one is a cure-all or a panacea for everything that's in there, but there was a lot of it was very Gemini. There was a lot of options for what is helpful. And I think that's one thing through just talking about my own personal midlife transits through this podcast mini series that I've been doing. It's a challenge to say like what I can say what was helpful for me, but
Mhm.
it might not be helpful
Right.
for people listening. And so yeah,
And
those
I think
the
that's particularly important when thinking about things like outer planet remediation or outer planet remedies is, and to me, so I'm not an astrologer to come to if you want like super prescriptive, detailed, this is what to do.
right.
My goal is to help you think astrologically, think about the world, think about your life, and then the remediations are kind of given as principles and you can adapt those principles in ways that make sense to your life. So if I say like, therapy is a good remediation, I don't mean like for Pluto, I don't mean like go out and find any therapist. I mean like what are the containers that help that hold depth and
Hmm.
depth oriented processes for you during Plutonian times? And that could be a literal therapist, that could be a group, that could be a dance class, that could be so many things. So like, the lecture does have those kinds of suggestions just with the understanding that you take it and make it work for your life and your situation.
Hmm. And I love that because one of the suggestions that's in there, along with many other amazing ones, was the plant medicine
Mm,
option, and not and again not for everyone, but
mm,
and I remember thinking about that because that was totally something that I utilized that I forgot about it because I wasn't necessarily ingesting it. It was the relationship that I had with plants, like in my environment, that was very healing for me and
yeah.
I felt held and seen in that way. And so it clued in like, yeah, even if you say one thing, it doesn't have to look a textbook way.
Yeah, I always tell people, especially working with me, like if I throw out a correspondence or a suggestion, I want you to go past your initial assumption about what that looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was really cool for me because I through listening to your lecture, I realized all these other things that I was
Mhm.
actually doing that I wouldn't have put like check,
Yeah.
as a remediation that I did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and with Pluto, it's if I just go back to like one of the first things I said, which is that Pluto has to do with those core coping mechanisms.
Hmm.
When you're in Plutonian periods or before you get there, it's like identifying what they are, which can be hard, and then like where did they come from? And are there parts of you that like are holding the crux of that need attention and care and
Hmm.
treatment? And then like what are do there need to be alternative coping strategies? Can
Mhm.
there be? And then sometimes even after you've done all that work, you get thrown into another vortex and it's like, nope, I'm going to do the old thing. And I'm just like, the
Yeah.
change here is that I'm aware that I'm doing it.
Yes, 100%. That is so, and that's so powerful. It's so powerful to have that moment of recognition. And it's not always, sometimes it's after you're like, oh,
Mhm.
I did the thing I said I wasn't going to do again. And like having compassion for that part of self. And then it gets to doing it and you're aware you're doing it.
Mhm.
And but it's slowly, it's a bridge of
Yeah.
moving from one way of being to another. And
Yeah,
so,
while like holding space for like, oh, those parts of me, those versions of me, like what a precious little being that was struggling so
mhm.
much.
Yeah, I have a lot of compassion for myself that
Mhm.
I didn't before.
Mhm.
And I think too, and then there'll be the times that you're just flattened,
Mhm.
possibly, maybe not for everyone in every scenario, but I can remember just laying on the ground for some,
Yeah.
in that moment, just not really knowing what to do, you
Mhm.
know?
Absolutely.
So, oh my goodness. Amanda, this was so rich. And I just, again, want to thank you so much for vulnerably like sharing your experience because it, again, it is out of, granted, I haven't been reading charts as long as you have and as other people have, but it's definitely like probably the most intense one that I've come across so
It's
far.
loud.
And yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's really one of those things that in astrology community we would say astrology
Good.
good experience not definitely
Yeah.
not good because it's such a demonstratable like you said it's an example or a story or I hate to use the word case study because you're so much more than that you're a human being but in terms of like the actual learning and application from
Yeah, I'll be a case
the
study.
train. I know I'm like me too my whole life is an experiment is the way I
Well, and
look at
that's,
it.
at the end of the midlife lecture, I did go into the chart of one person, but I looked at the charts of, Tori Amos and Stevie Nicks, and like,
True.
because you can see the songs that were written during these transits. And, that's another really fascinating and rich way to learn about transits is looking at the people whose art
Yeah.
you're interested in.
100% agree about that. Yeah, I have been in something I'm exploring right now, and she's problematic. A lot of some of her writing, well, everybody's problematic in
Everybody
some
is.
way, but this person in particular who I've been enjoying, and there's a lot written about her life, and then also her works is Sylvia Plath, like looking
Mhm.
at like her. So if you have someone or
Mhm.
someone you want to learn about, like that's another great way to do it. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. And I'm excited to see how it continues to unfold and like shape your work and the memoir. I know it'll be coming at some
Mhm.
point in time. And so Amanda, what do you have in terms of your offerings right now? What do you have available or coming up for folks?
I have a whole lot of me trying to figure out what's next. I just finished a 6-week course called Theophany that was about developing a direct relationship with planets as ancestors and deities, and that will be released as a self-paced course along with several others at some point soon. I am revamping my evolutionary astrology immersion, and it's going to be more module based, and the first one's going to be I think, a very like mythological, experiential introduction to Pluto.
Mm,
So it'll be a cohort-based teaching. I want people who want to show up. I want people who want to do the readings and all of that stuff.
yeah.
So we'll be exploring shadow and things like that. And then, I have a Patreon where I do chart clinics where folks can come up and practice reading charts and ask questions about their chart and their life. We do astro circles through it. It's a really affordable way to get one-on-one sessions with me. Uh, Probably some other things that I'm not
Yeah.
thinking of.
And we'll link them in the show notes as
Oh,
always.
and I'll be at the Living Astrologies conference in Santa Fe in October, which
Yeah.
is sold out, but it's awesome. And
Hmm.
I hope that it happens again. So people should check
Yeah.
that out.
And I think there's a wait list for it too. And so
Yes.
it doesn't hurt. I know tons, not tons. I can count them on one hand. I know a few people who were on the wait list for Norwalk this year to see it
Hmm.
and got to go
Right.
because it does happen. Things do
Hmm.
happen. So check that out. Yeah, I'm excited. I think you're the session that I signed up for that you're teaching there is the calling the corners, the
Hmm.
squares and oppositions, working with squares and oppositions.
Yeah,
So I'm excited for that. I
me
love us.
too.
I actually, okay, confession. I've had this period where I've been in a lot of trines and I realize like I need the square to like
You need the
push
grit.
against.
Yeah, yeah.
Do I want squares and oppositions all the time? No, but like I need that little bit of
Mhm.
tension to
Give
push
me
me.
give me a tiny bit of confrontation. That was not a request, universe, but
I
like
know, for real. For real. We'll find it on our own. Don't worry. But yeah.
they're juicy.
And we'll link your website and your social and where to find you like in the show notes as well. But thank you so much, Amanda,
Thank
for
you. And to anybody who's still listening, thank you for listening.
yes, definitely. And that was my episode with Amanda. I hope you enjoyed it. So definitely check out the links in the show notes. Follow Amanda on Instagram, sign up for her newsletter, listen to her podcast, and stay in touch to learn more about the forthcoming evolutionary astrology immersion, especially if anything that we talked about today appealed to you. And remember that you can check out my website, slowmagic.com, to learn more about me and my offerings and check out the Sovereign 2025 cohort. Okay, I am wishing you lots and lots of love from all the places in between. Until next time.